His knees buckled first, then his whole body folded right there at the base of a granite wall carved with 4,000 names, a photograph clutched so tightly in his fist that paramedics had to pry his fingers open one by one. 300 bikers who'd known him less than a week surrounded him instantly, some praying, some shouting for help, all refusing to let a stranger's grandfather die alone on a mountainside. But this wasn't really about a collapse. It was about 57 years of silence finally breaking open, and about a promise nobody living had ever spoken aloud, until one leather-clad stranger recognized a single name on a wall, and everything the old man had carried alone suddenly wasn't alone anymore. The autumn morning settled over Asheville like a grey wool blanket, mist curling low through the Blue Ridge foothills as Raymond Whitfield shuffled down Hayward Street with the careful, deliberate steps of a man who no longer trusted his own knees. He was 78 years old, and every joint in his body reminded him of it daily, but he made this walk regardless. 3 blocks from his apartment to the Sunrise Diner, rain or shine, every single morning since his wife Kathleen had passed 4 years earlier. The photograph rode in his shirt pocket, close to his heart, the way it had for 47 years. He didn't need to look at it anymore to see the face. His younger brother Michael, 22 years old forever, grinning in his army fatigues just 3 weeks before the helicopter went down outside Da Nang. Raymond had been 24 then, home from his own tour, and he'd carried that photograph through 2 marriages, 1 divorce, a career installing HVAC systems, and more sleepless nights than he could count. The diner's bell chimed as he pushed through the door, and Doris behind the counter gave him the same nod she gave him every morning. Coffee, black, 2 eggs over easy wheat toast. Raymond had barely settled into his usual booth by the window when he heard it. The low, rolling thunder of motorcycle engines, dozens of them echoing off the brick storefronts of downtown Asheville. He watched through the window as they came, an unbroken line of them turning off Broadway, leather vests catching the weak morning light, chrome pipes rumbling loud enough to rattle the diner's windows. Riders in their 40s and 50s and 60s, some with grey beards down to their chests, patches on their vests that read things Raymond couldn't quite make out from this distance. They parked in a long row along the curb outside, engine after engine cutting off in a cascade of settling silence. "Lord have mercy," muttered a woman 2 booths over, clutching her purse a little tighter. "That's got to be near 200 of them." Doris refilled Raymond's coffee without looking up. "Word is, there's some kind of motorcycle rally passing through this weekend. They've been trickling in since Thursday." Raymond said nothing, just watched. He'd seen men like this before, not these particular men, but the type. Big, weathered, tattooed, wearing their toughness like armor. In his younger years he might have crossed the street to avoid a crowd like this. Now he mostly just felt tired, and a little curious, and achingly aware of the photograph in his pocket because Michael had always wanted a motorcycle. Had saved up $200 for one before Vietnam took that future away, along with everything else. The bikers didn't come into the diner, not at first. They gathered on the sidewalk, talking in low voices, some of them checking phones, others simply standing with their arms crossed, surveying the street like they were waiting for something. A police cruiser rolled slowly past, and Raymond noticed the officer inside, eyeing the gathered riders with obvious suspicion before continuing on. "They oughtn't be allowed to just take over a sidewalk like that," the purse-clutching woman said to her companion, loud enough for half the diner to hear. "Bad enough with the noise, now it's like Sturgis moved to Asheville." A young couple near the door gathered their children a little closer as they left, and Raymond watched the mother steer her son wide around the cluster of leather-clad men on the sidewalk, as if proximity itself were dangerous. One of the bikers, a heavy-set man with a silver beard and a denim vest layered over leather, caught the woman's expression and simply nodded politely, stepping back to give them more room. The woman didn't nod back. Raymond found himself studying the patches on the nearest rider's vest. Beneath a large center patch reading Steel Wardens MC, there was a smaller rocker patch, Vietnam Veterans Chapter. His stomach did something strange, something between a lurch and a settling, like a key turning in a lock he'd forgotten existed. He finished his eggs slowly, watching the riders through the window, listening to the murmur of judgment rippling through the diner around him, comments about noise ordinances, about gang activity, about how a person doesn't dress like that unless they want trouble. Nobody in the diner seemed to notice the patches. Nobody seemed to wonder why 200 grown men, many of them clearly in their 60s and 70s themselves, had gathered on a Tuesday morning in downtown Asheville with such quiet purpose. Raymond paid his bill, left his usual tip, and stepped outside into the cool mountain air. The silver-bearded man with the Steel Warden's patch was standing nearest the door, and as Raymond approached, the man stepped aside without being asked, the same courtesy he'd shown the young mother, except this time something in his eyes shifted as he looked at Raymond, really looked, the way one old soldier sometimes recognizes another before a word is spoken. "Morning," the biker said. "Morning," Raymond replied, and would have kept walking except his hand drifted unconsciously to his shirt pocket, to the photograph, and the movement wasn't lost on the biker's sharp eyes. "You all right there, sir?" "Fine," Raymond said, though his voice wavered more than he intended. "Just, my brother always wanted one of these." He nodded toward the long row of motorcycles gleaming with morning dew. "Never got the chance." Something passed across the big man's face, not pity, which Raymond would have hated, but a kind of recognition. "What happened to him, if you don't mind my asking?" "Vietnam," Raymond said. 1969. He was 22. The biker was quiet for a moment. Around them, the low murmur of the gathered riders continued, oblivious to this small exchange happening at the edge of their formation. Then the man extended a broad, calloused hand. "Name's Douglas Merrick. I run this chapter." Raymond shook it. "Raymond Whitfield." "Whitfield," Douglas repeated, something flickering behind his eyes, though Raymond couldn't have said what. "You have a good day, Mr. Whitfield, and don't mind them." He tilted his head very slightly toward the diner window, where several faces still watched the gathered riders with open wariness. People see the leather before they see the man wearing it. Always have. Raymond nodded slowly, understanding that sentiment more than Douglas Merrick could possibly know, and continued his walk home, unaware that this brief exchange, two names spoken aloud on a sidewalk, had just set something into motion that neither man could have predicted. Douglas Merrick did not sleep well that night. He lay in his hotel bed on the outskirts of Asheville, staring at the water-stained ceiling tiles, turning the name Whitfield over and over in his mind, like a stone he couldn't quite identify, but knew he'd carried before. He'd been the road captain for the Steel Wardens Vietnam Veterans Chapter for 11 years now, ever since his own service had ended, and he'd found, almost by accident, a kind of brotherhood among men who understood things that civilians never could. The chapter had grown from a dozen riders to nearly 300 members across 4 states, bound together by shared history and an annual tradition. The Memorial Ride, a cross-country journey each October that stopped in towns and cities to honor fallen veterans, culminating each year at a different memorial site. This year, the ride was different. This year, they were headed toward the newly dedicated Blue Ridge Veterans Memorial outside Asheville, where a wall bearing the names of over 4,000 North Carolina servicemen killed in Vietnam had been unveiled just 8 months prior. Douglas had visited it twice already during planning trips, running his fingers along the granite, searching, as he always did at any memorial, for names he recognized. He hadn't found what he was looking for. Not yet. At 5 a.m., unable to sleep any longer, Douglas pulled out the worn leather journal he'd carried for over 3 decades, his service record, transcribed and annotated, filled with the names of men from his unit, men who never came home. He flipped to a page near the back, one he rarely opened because of what it contained. A list of 7 names, men from an attached support unit whose helicopter had gone down during a resupply mission outside Da Nang in March of 1969. Douglas hadn't known any of them personally. He'd been assigned to a different company entirely, but he'd carried their names anyway because the mission that killed them had been meant to resupply his own unit, and for years he'd wrestled with a guilt that made no logical sense, but refused to loosen its grip regardless. One of the 7 names was Michael Whitfield. Douglas sat on the edge of his hotel bed for a long time, journal open in his lap, feeling something crack open inside his chest that he'd kept sealed for 57 years. By 7 a.m., he'd gathered 4 of his oldest riding brothers in the hotel lobby, men who'd served alongside him, who knew the story of the 7 names even if they'd never met the families attached to them. Gregory Ashford, the chapter's unofficial historian, listened to Douglas's account with the careful attention of a man who understood the weight of coincidence in a world that rarely offered closure. "You're certain it's the same Whitfield?" Gregory asked. "There's one way to find out," Douglas said. They found Raymond's address through the diner. Doris, once she understood their intentions, was more than willing to help. Her earlier wariness dissolving the moment Douglas explained, quietly and without theatrics, why they were asking. She'd watched Raymond eat breakfast alone at that same booth for 4 years. She cared about him more than her cautious demeanor towards strangers had let on. Douglas approached the modest apartment building alone that afternoon, leaving the others behind. This conversation, he sensed, needed to happen without an audience. He knocked, and when Raymond opened the door, surprise and something like wariness crossed the old man's weathered face. "Mr. Merrick," Raymond said, "this is unexpected. May I come in? I think I have something that belongs to you. Or rather, I think we might have something in common that I didn't understand until last night." Raymond hesitated, decades of instinct telling him to be cautious with strangers who showed up at his door, but something in Douglas's eyes, steady, careful, almost apologetic, made him step back and allow the big man inside. They sat at Raymond's small kitchen table, and Douglas explained. His own service, the resupply mission, the guilt he'd carried for a helicopter crash that killed men from a unit he'd never even served alongside, but felt tethered to nonetheless. He explained the wall, the 4,000 names, the 7 from that particular mission that he'd copied into his journal decades ago and never stopped carrying. "Michael Whitfield," Douglas said finally. "Was that your brother?" Raymond's hands, resting on the table, began to tremble. He reached into his shirt pocket, the same motion Douglas had noticed on the sidewalk the day before, and withdrew the photograph, worn soft at the edges from nearly 5 decades of handling. He slid it across the table without a word. Douglas looked down at the young man's face, grinning in his fatigues, and felt the strange vertigo of meeting someone he'd never known, but had thought about in some fashion nearly every year of his adult life. "I've carried his name for 57 years, Douglas said quietly. "Never knew a single thing about the man behind it. Never knew he had a brother who still carries his photograph in his shirt pocket." Raymond's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "Nobody talks about him anymore. My wife used to listen before she passed. My kids were born after. They know the story, but it's just a story to them. A sad chapter about an uncle they never met." He looked up, eyes wet. "You're the first person in 15 years who said his name like it meant something to say it." Douglas reached across the table and gripped Raymond's forearm. An unspoken understanding passing between 2 men separated by decades of silence and a single shared thread of memory. "Mr. Whitfield, I'd like to ask you something, and I want you to know there's no pressure attached to your answer. Tomorrow, our chapter rides out to the Blue Ridge Veterans Memorial to honor the names on that wall, including your brothers. Would you consider joining us, not as a guest, as family?" Raymond stared at the photograph on the table between them. at his brother's young, unweathered, permanently 22-year-old face, and felt something shift in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Not grief, though grief was still there, woven into everything. Something more like recognition, like being seen. "I don't have a motorcycle," Raymond said, and the corner of his mouth twitched upward, the first genuine, almost smile Douglas had seen from him. "You don't need one," Douglas said. "You've got 300 brothers who do." Word travels fast in a small diner, and faster still when the word involves nearly 200 leather-clad strangers descending on quiet residential blocks. By Wednesday evening, the story of Douglas Merrick's visit to Raymond Whitfield's apartment had spread through the neighborhood in fragmented, distorted pieces. A game of telephone played out over backyard fences and grocery store checkout lines. "I heard those bikers are trying to get money out of him," said Carol Danvers, who lived 2 doors down from Raymond and had never once in 4 years invited him to a single neighborhood gathering. "Poor old man, all alone since his wife passed. Those gang types can smell vulnerability." "They were at his apartment for over an hour," her husband added, though he had no actual knowledge of what had transpired inside, only that he'd seen a large man in a leather vest walking up the front steps and hadn't seen him leave until considerably later. The rumor calcified further at the Sunrise Diner the next morning, where Doris found herself in the unusual position of defending the very group of strangers she'd been quietly wary of just 2 days prior. "They're not gang types," she told a table of regulars, her voice sharper than usual. "One of them lost men from his unit the same day Raymond's brother died. That's not a con. That's history finding its way back around." Not everyone believed her. Pamela Whitcomb, who ran the flower shop next to the diner and considered herself something of a neighborhood watchdog, took it upon herself to call the non-emergency police line, reporting suspicious activity and possible elder exploitation involving an unnamed motorcycle gang and an elderly resident on Cumberland Avenue. Officer Brenda Kowalski, a 12-year veteran of the Asheville Police Department, was dispatched to look into the complaint. She found Raymond sitting on his front porch that Thursday afternoon, coffee in hand, seemingly unbothered by anything resembling distress or exploitation. "Mr. Whitfield, I've received a report of concern regarding some visitors you've had this week," Officer Kowalski said, keeping her tone carefully neutral, professional. "Motorcycle club members. I wanted to check in, make sure everything's all right." Raymond looked at her with the patient, slightly amused expression of a man who had lived 78 years and developed a healthy tolerance for other people's misplaced worry. "Everything is more than all right, officer. Would you like to sit down? I could tell you a story if you have a few minutes." She did sit, initially out of professional obligation, but within 10 minutes found herself genuinely absorbed as Raymond recounted the details. His brother Michael, the helicopter, the 57 years of a stranger named Douglas Merrick, carrying 7 names in a leather journal without ever knowing the families behind them. By the time Raymond finished, Officer Kowalski's notepad remained closed in her lap, forgotten. "That's—" she started, then stopped, searching for the right words. "That's one of the more remarkable things I've heard in this job. People see the leather before they see the man wearing it," Raymond said, echoing words Douglas had spoken to him just days before, though he didn't yet fully understand how deeply he'd come to believe them himself. "I understand the instinct, officer. I might have felt the same way once. But I've learned something this week that I wish I'd understood 40 years ago." "What's that?" "That grief doesn't check credentials. It doesn't care what a man wears or what his motorcycle sounds like. Sometimes the person who understands your loss best is a total stranger who happened to carry the same weight from a different direction for the same number of years." Officer Kowalski left without filing any further report, though she did make a point of driving past Cumberland Avenue on her patrol the following morning. Less out of suspicion now, and more out of a quiet curiosity about how the story would continue. That curiosity, it turned out, was shared by more of the neighborhood than anyone might have expected. Word of the police visit and Raymond's calm, unbothered response began to shift the narrative circulating through Asheville's older residential streets. Some residents remained skeptical, unwilling to release their initial judgment so easily. But others, including Pamela Whitcomb herself, found themselves reconsidering. "I only called because I was worried," Pamela told Doris at the diner counter Friday morning, her voice carrying an uncertain note of embarrassment. "I didn't think anyone could actually be that kind, not people who look like that." "Grief doesn't care what a person looks like," Doris repeated, quoting Raymond without quite realizing she was doing so. Maybe it's time the rest of us learned that too. Meanwhile, at the memorial site 8 miles outside town, Douglas Merrick and his chapter's leadership were finalizing preparations for Saturday's ceremony. A ceremony that had, in the span of 3 days, transformed from a routine annual observance into something far more personal. Word had spread through the riding community as well, chapter to chapter, about the Whitfield brothers and the 57-year thread that had finally found its way to closure. Riders who'd originally planned to attend from neighboring states began adjusting their schedules, wanting to be present for what everyone now understood would be a deeply significant moment. By Friday evening, Douglas's phone had received confirmation that the ride would include not the original planned 200 riders, but closer to 300. Chapters from Tennessee and South Carolina rerouting their own travel to be present, drawn by a story that had moved through their community like a current, finding the shortest path downhill. Raymond, for his part, spent Friday evening at his kitchen table, looking through an old cigar box he hadn't opened in years. Letters Michael had written home during his brief deployment, a few more photographs, a pair of dog tags that had been returned to the family decades ago. He selected one additional item to bring with him to the memorial, a folded American flag, the one presented to his parents at Michael's memorial service in 1969, kept safe through 2 subsequent house moves and countless years of quiet, private grief. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Raymond Whitfield slept soundly through the entire night. Saturday morning arrived crisp and clear, the Blue Ridge Mountains sharp against a pale October sky, and by 9 a.m., the parking area outside the Blue Ridge Veterans Memorial had filled with an almost overwhelming procession of motorcycles, nearly 300 of them, engines finally silenced, riders gathering in loose formation across the memorial grounds. Raymond stood near Douglas Merrick, at the front of the assembly, wearing his best collared shirt, the photograph of Michael tucked once more into his breast pocket alongside the folded flag he carried cradled in both arms. He felt smaller than usual amid the sea of leather and denim, but not diminished. If anything, he felt something closer to enveloped, surrounded by nearly 300 strangers who had reorganized their weekend, in some cases their entire travel plans, to stand beside him at this moment. The ceremony began simply. A local pastor offered a brief invocation, careful and inclusive. A young Marine color guard presented arms. Then Gregory Ashford, the chapter's historian, stepped forward with a printed program and began reading names. Not all 4,000, which would have taken the better part of a day, but a representative selection drawn from each county the memorial served, meant to honor the whole through the specific. When Gregory reached the 7th name on his list, Michael Andrew Whitfield, Buncombe County, killed in action March 14, 1969, Douglas placed a steady hand on Raymond's shoulder, and the old man felt his knees buckle slightly beneath the sudden, overwhelming weight of 57 years, compressing into a single spoken sentence. He did not fall. Douglas's grip held him steady, and around them riders who had never met Raymond Whitfield before this week, who knew him only through a story passed between chapters over the course of 4 days, lowered their heads in genuine, unrehearsed respect. After the reading concluded, riders were invited to approach the granite wall individually, to find names of significance and leave tokens of remembrance. The base of the memorial was already scattered with small flags, medallions, unit patches, photographs laminated against the weather. Raymond made his way slowly toward the section where Michael's name was etched, Douglas walking beside him, matching his careful pace without ever seeming to hover or hurry. When Raymond's fingers finally touched the carved letters of his brother's name, something in him broke open that had been sealed shut for decades. Not violently, but like a dam finally allowing water through after years of controlled pressure. He wept, openly and without embarrassment, for the first time since Michael's funeral in 1969, when he'd been a 24-year-old man, determined to appear strong for his grieving parents. "I'm sorry it took me so long to say your name out loud again," Raymond whispered to the granite. "I never stopped carrying you. I just didn't know how to keep saying it." Douglas stood a respectful distance back, giving Raymond the privacy the moment demanded, though his own eyes were far from dry. Around them, nearly 300 riders had spread across the memorial grounds, each finding their own names, their own private grief, the collective weight of the ceremony settling over the mountainside like the morning mist that had finally burned away under the strengthening sun. It was Gregory who noticed Raymond sway several minutes later, still standing before the wall, the flag clutched tightly against his chest and the photograph now held in his trembling hand as though he needed physical proof of his brother's face, even while touching his brother's name. "Douglas," Gregory said sharply, already moving. Raymond's legs gave out entirely this time, the accumulated weight of grief and relief and 57 years of solitary carrying finally overwhelming a body already worn thin by age. Douglas caught him before he hit the ground, lowering him gently onto the grass, and the cry that went up from the nearest riders brought 290-some hardened men and women rushing toward a single fallen figure at the base of a granite wall. "Someone call for help!" Douglas shouted, cradling Raymond's head, checking for breath, finding it shallow but present. "He's breathing. Raymond, stay with me, you hear? Stay with me." Raymond's eyes fluttered, his hand still locked around the photograph, even in his semi-conscious state, and Douglas felt something fierce and protective ignite in his chest. The same instinct that had driven him through combat decades ago. The same instinct that had kept him circling back to 7 names in a leather journal for 57 years, refusing to let this final connection slip away now that he'd finally found it. The ambulance arrived 12 minutes later, though it felt considerably longer to the assembled crowd, who had formed a protective circle around Raymond. Some riders praying quietly, others simply standing in solemn, watchful silence. As the paramedics loaded Raymond onto a gurney, still clutching the photograph despite gentle attempts to set it aside, Douglas climbed into the ambulance alongside him without asking permission from anyone. "Family?" one paramedic asked, glancing at Douglas's leather vest and grey beard with obvious skepticism. "Yes," Douglas said without hesitation, without a flicker of doubt. "We're family." The Asheville Hospital's cardiac unit had never before seen a waiting room fill quite the way it did that Saturday afternoon. Nurses exchanged bewildered glances as leather-clad riders arrived in 2s and 3s, then dozens, then nearly the entire chapter, spilling out of the waiting room and into the hallways, some standing vigil outside in the parking lot when space inside ran out entirely. Dr. Patricia Simmons, the attending cardiologist, emerged after 90 minutes to find what looked less like a typical hospital waiting room and more like an assembly of a small, solemn army, every face turned toward her with the same anxious question. "Are you all here for Mr. Whitfield?" she asked, genuinely startled by the scale of the gathering. "Every one of us," Douglas confirmed, stepping forward as the group's unofficial spokesman. "How is he?" Dr. Simmons's expression softened slightly. "He experienced what we believe was a combination of severe emotional shock and a minor cardiac event. His heart rate spiked significantly and then dropped too fast. At his age, and given the circumstances, it's not entirely surprising. But I want to be clear, he's stable. He's going to be all right. We'll want to keep him for observation for a day or two, run some additional tests, but the prognosis is good. A collective exhale moved through the waiting room like a physical wave, some riders embracing, others simply closing their eyes in relief. Douglas felt his own knees weaken slightly with the release of tension he'd been carrying since the moment Raymond collapsed on the grass beside his brother's name. "Can we see him?" Gregory asked. "Family only for now," Dr. Simmons said, and Douglas noticed several riders shift uncomfortably at the word, understanding the boundary even as it stung. "Though I understand he doesn't have much family in the immediate area." "We're his family," Douglas said again, the same words he'd used in the ambulance, though this time he explained further. "Not by blood, but by something that runs just as deep, maybe deeper, considering how far it's traveled to find him." "Doctor." Simmons studied the assembled crowd for a long moment, nearly 300 people who had, by all appearances, dropped every other obligation to converge on a hospital for a man most of them had known for less than a week. Something in their collective bearing, the raw sincerity of their concern, seemed to answer whatever hesitation she carried. "I'll allow 2 visitors at a time," she said. "But keep it brief. He needs rest." Douglas and Gregory went first, finding Raymond propped up in his hospital bed, pale but conscious, the photograph of Michael resting on the bedside table, where a nurse had apparently placed it after prying it gently from his grip. Raymond's eyes found Douglas immediately, and something like embarrassment crossed his weathered features. "I made quite a scene," Raymond said, his voice thin but steady. "You gave us all the fright of our lives," Douglas said, pulling a chair close to the bed. "But you're not allowed to apologize for grief, Raymond, not after 57 years of carrying it alone." "I wasn't alone," Raymond said, and his eyes drifted toward the door, toward the muffled sound of voices filling the hallway and waiting room beyond. "I don't think I've ever been less alone in my life than I was this past week." Gregory, standing at the foot of the bed, cleared his throat. "The chapter took a vote while you were being examined. It was unanimous, in case you're wondering, which almost never happens with 300 opinionated old bikers in a room together." He smiled, the first light moment since the collapse. "We'd like to make you an honorary member of the Steel Wardens Vietnam Veterans chapter, not because of your brother, though that's certainly what brought us together, but because of who you are, because of how you've carried this. Because you reminded every single one of us this week why we started riding together in the first place." Raymond's eyes filled again, though this time the tears carried something closer to joy than grief. "I don't have a motorcycle," he said, echoing his own joke from days before. "We've got that handled," Douglas said, grinning beneath his silver beard. "There's a 3-wheeler with your name on it whenever you're ready. No rush. Whenever your heart's ready to keep pace with the rest of us." Word of Raymond's recovery and the chapter's gesture spread through Asheville over the following days, reaching first the diner regulars, then the wider neighborhood, then eventually the local news, which ran a brief segment about the unlikely brotherhood formed between an elderly Vietnam veteran's family member and a motorcycle club, initially regarded with suspicion by much of the community. Pamela Whitcomb, the flower shop owner who had once called the police over unfounded concerns, sent a bouquet to Raymond's hospital room with a handwritten card that simply read, "I'm sorry I judged what I didn't understand. Welcome home, Mr. Whitfield." Raymond was discharged 4 days later, greeted in the hospital parking lot, not by an ambulance this time, but by an honor guard of nearly 50 riders who had waited through the morning to escort him home, engines idling in respectful patience until he was settled and ready. The procession moved slowly through downtown Asheville, past the Sunrise Diner, where Doris stood on the sidewalk waving, past Cumberland Avenue, where several neighbors, including Carol Danvers, who had once whispered rumors of exploitation, stood on their porches to watch the strange and beautiful procession pass. That evening, Raymond sat on his porch as the sun set behind the Blue Ridge Mountains, the photograph of Michael resting on the small table beside him, no longer confined to the darkness of his shirt pocket, but displayed openly, proudly, for the first time in decades. Douglas Merrick sat beside him, having decided to extend his stay in Asheville by another week before the chapter continued its long journey home. "He would have liked you," Raymond said quietly, nodding toward the photograph. Michael. He always did gravitate toward people who didn't take themselves too seriously, but took everything else seriously enough. "Sounds like we would have gotten along," Douglas said. "Sounds like maybe, in some way, we finally did." Raymond considered this for a long moment, watching the last light fade behind the mountains, feeling for the first time in longer than he could remember something that resembled peace rather than mere endurance. 57 years, he said. "I spent 57 years thinking I was the only one still carrying him. Turns out I just hadn't met the right people yet." "Grief's funny that way," Douglas said. "It convinces you you're alone right up until the moment you discover you never were." They sat together as darkness settled fully over Asheville. Two men from vastly different lives, bound together by 7 names in a leather journal and a photograph that had traveled 47 years in a shirt pocket, finally, impossibly, coming home to rest.